Hello, I'm your host, Karen Olsoy. I'm a licensed master esthetician, owner of Grove and Cane, and also a skincare educator. And this is Skincare Deep Dive. Have you ever thought to yourself, oh my gosh, my skin is so dry, I really need to drink more water? Well, it turns out there's a lot of factors that play into your skin hydration, and drinking water is really not the biggest one. So, today I'm going to take you on a journey through the skin's different layers to learn about how the skin really regulates and maintains hydration. Let's get into it. First, let's do a little bit of vocabulary because I know for a lot of you it's been a while since you learned these things. Let's talk about the word humectant. A humectant is a chemical that really likes water and binds to water. Some of the most popular ones that you'll hear about are hyaluronic acid, glycerin, gluconolactone, just to name a few. Then we have occlusive. An occlusive is something kind of heavy. So something like petrolatum, silicones, waxy substances. An occlusive is what's going to trap and retain moisture. So whereas a humectant is going to bind to water, an occlusive is going to form a barrier to prevent water loss. And occlusives are going to feel, again, like I said, kind of heavier. Then we have emollients. Emollients are going to add softness to the skin. Think about oils. So things like coconut oil, palm oil, shea butter, almond, jojoba, avocado oil, right? There are so many different oils that we use in skincare. And these also can be used as occlusives. So oils can also kind of sit on the surface of the skin, preventing water loss as well. And then let's quickly review the layers of the epidermis. So we're going to be talking just about the epidermis today. It's split into really two different layers. So the epidermis has the viable layer, which is comprised of 3/4 different layers. And then we have the non-viable layer known as the stratum corneum. Starting at the base, we have the stratum basal or the basal layer. That's where we have those stem cells that are constantly dividing and creating new tissue. Then above that is the spiny layer or the stratum spinosum. It's called that because you can actually see these desmosomes forming that kind of look like spines, and that's what's going to help to connect those cells together. Above that, we have the grainy layer or the stratum granulosum, and that is named for these little granules that are actually visible, and those granules are actually organelles that play a very important role in skin hydration, which we will see. And we also do have another layer on our hands and our feet, the stratum lucidum, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're primarily talking about the skin on the face in the aesthetics industry, so we're just going to forget about that layer. So we talked about the viable layer with those three main layers. Now let's talk about the non-viable layer, the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is comprised mostly of corneocytes. So we're going to be using the word corneocyte a lot today, and that's just the name for the cells, the keratinocytes that have terminally differentiated. And what that means is that they are no longer going to be changing forms anymore. That is their final resting place. They're going to be a corneocyte, and then they're going to shed off of the surface of the skin eventually. The corneocytes, even though they are technically now dead, and that's why it's called the non-viable layer, they're still very dynamic and there's still a lot going on in the stratum corneum. And it turns out that the stratum corneum is crucially important in how our skin regulates and maintains hydration. Okay, so let's start in the viable layer. So the viable layer is the lower part of the epidermis. This part is made up of about 70% water. Primarily, this water is being transported around throughout the layers through the help of a particular channel. This channel is made out of proteins called aquaporin 3 or AQP3. And that protein, again, forms these water channels within the cell membranes of the keratinocytes. That is what's going to allow water and other chemicals into the cells quickly and efficiently. So this is a very efficient process that the lower levels of the epidermis are able to get water and these different ingredients around very quickly through these channels. You'll find aquaporin 3 expressed in the cell membranes of all the cell layers except in the stratum corneum. Remember that non-viable layer. We think that there's no aquaporin 3 there because in the stratum corneum, the focus is really changing from being able to quickly hydrate and ferry ingredients around to just simply preventing water loss. So no longer do we have that really cool aquaporin 3 in the stratum corneum. Other important things to know about how water moves around. So first of all, water is not just freely flowing around. It's almost always bound to humectants. So yes, we use humectants in skincare, but our body and our skin actually creates them too, right? And so some of the most prominent ones are going to be glycerol, or glycerin, urea, and hyaluronic acid. So glycerin is a very common ingredient in skincare. I used to think of it almost as filler because it's in so many things, but it turns out that it's actually a really important humectant. It's called glycerin when it's commercially made, but when our skin creates it, it's called glycerol. And so these three different humectants are working together and they're binding water. It's through this binding of water that they're able to kind of ferry water around. So again, most of the time, water is actually bound to humectants. It's not moving around by itself. Interestingly, it's not just about hydration though. These humectants have other really important jobs in our skin. For instance, our keratinocytes actually have tons of receptor sites on the outsides of their cells for hyaluronic acid. So it seems like hyaluronic acid not only is helping the skin move water around and trap hydration, it's actually helping to stimulate the development of keratinocytes, and it's also encouraging lipid formation. Lipid formation is going to be especially important when we get up to the stratum corneum and we start to create that lipid layer that's responsible for the prevention of water loss. And glycerol is interestingly made through our sebum. So our sebum actually has the chemical precursors for glycerol. I used to think that, oily people, they seem to be able to maintain that skin hydration better simply because that oil was trapping hydration like an occlusive, right? And that is part of the story. But it turns out that sebum also has many, many chemical precursors that then turn into different important compounds like glycerol and other humectants. So that's another important thing to know. And also part of the story as to why people that have naturally oily skin tend to age better and have a better, more easy time maintaining skin hydration and their barrier function. Okay, so there's two main ways that the stratum corneum regulates hydration, right? So there's the natural moisture factor and then that lipid layer. Let's start with the natural moisture factor. This is a watery substance found within the corneocytes of the stratum corneum. About 80% of the water found in the stratum corneum is actually bound up inside the corneocytes themselves. So there's not water flowing around intercellularly in between the cells. It's really all bound up within the cells. And this natural moisture factor is made up of course, water, but then also naturally occurring humectants, such as amino acids, lactates, urea, and electrolytes like potassium and calcium. But the most important part of the natural moisture factor are these humectants in the form of free amino acids, and they are extremely powerful humectants. And again, humectants are compounds that bind to water, right? So the natural moisture factor forms through the breakdown of one very important protein called filaggrin that had previously formed the important connections and structural components of the keratinocyte. So this compound, it's a big protein, and it was providing kind of structural support within the keratinocyte. But then as it breaks down, it's going to form these little smaller segments, these smaller amino acids that then become these powerful humectants known as the natural moisture factor. And it breaks down through enzyme reactions within the corneocyte. The natural moisture factor can be depleted through a variety of ways. So it's not just oiliness that plays a role in skin hydration. Again, I used to think that, as we get older, people are more prone to dryness because they make less oil. And that's part of the story, but not the whole story. So number one, in old age, we do make less of this natural moisture factor. Certain people genetically don't make it as well, or in certain skin conditions like eczema. That's a big part of it. That filaggrin compound, there's problems with that. And people with eczema don't make that natural moisture factor as effectively, which leads to impaired barrier function and other parts of that disease. So besides old age, certain skin diseases, those can deplete or cause a reduction in that natural moisture factor, leading to skin hydration. There's a few other things too. Using harsh surfactants like soap, super foamy substances will kind of draw out that natural moisture factor and deplete you, causing skin dryness. We've all kind of been there. Think about using like a bar soap. If you were to use that on your face, how tight and dry your skin would become, right? UV exposure. UV exposure actually really depletes that natural moisture factor. But here's a really, really key one. And I'm going to come back to this a few more times, but it turns out that the relative humidity, the amount of moisture in the air around your skin is the most important part of a most important factor in your skin hydration. And when the humidity drops, that natural moisture factor is also going to be depleted. It's going to be drawn out of the cell. It's going to be removed, leading to skin dryness. So that relative humidity is the biggest culprit of drying our skin out. Now, this happens pretty much every winter. So I can set my watch by it in my own practice. In October, that first day when the temperature starts to drop, I start to see my clients coming in with really dry, irritated skin. And it's not the cold that's doing it. It turns out it's our indoor heating systems, because when you take cold air from the outside and then you heat it up, that heated up air is really, really low in humidity. So the moisture level in the air is going to take a big dive in the wintertime. And again, it's not the cold, it's heating systems in your car, in your office, and in your home. That is what's going to draw moisture out of your skin and suck you dry. So we just talked about the natural moisture factor. Now let's talk about the second important thing about the stratum corneum that helps us to retain moisture. That is the lipid barrier. The official name for it is the stratum corneum lipid matrix. This lipid barrier is made up of three important components. Ceramides, we've all heard of that. And those are kind of waxy substances. Then we have cholesterol and also free fatty acids. And this lipid barrier is actually organized in a very tightly packed, layered organization. So if you've ever heard the term brick and mortar for people describing the structure of the stratum corneum, the lipid layer is the mortar, or that kind of glue in between the bricks, which are the corneocytes. So I have alluded a few times to the granules in that granular layer, right? The important job of those granules is actually to secrete the components of this lipid layer. So at the junction between the granular layer and the stratum corneum, the granules within those keratinocytes are going to start to actually secrete these ceramides and these waxy substances, the cholesterol and the free fatty acids, into the intercellular spaces. That is what is going to create that lipid layer to prevent moisture loss. So this lipid layer is actually going to be the primary way that water and other ingredients get into our skin, interestingly. The corneocytes are a little bit harder to diffuse ingredients and water into, but it's this lipid matrix, this lipid layer, that's a little bit more dynamic, and it's a little easier for certain ingredients and water actually to get in and out. So the stratum corneum and sometimes the lipid layer is often described as a watertight barrier. But it's really not. Water does indeed pass through it both ways, but it's just doing that in a much more slow, controlled manner. Interestingly, we lose about 10 to 13 ounces of water through our skin every single day. And it's primarily through this lipid barrier. Healthy skin does allow for some movement of water, but in diseased skin, or when there's damage to the stratum corneum, aka called impaired barrier function, transepidermal water loss is going to really increase. So if you've ever heard the word TOOL, transepidermal water loss, that's referring to the accelerated loss of water through our stratum corneum. Let's say that it's February, which means that it's cold outside and the indoor humidity is super low. And let's say, just for the fun of it, that you've decided to start using a new exfoliant and you're using it a ton, right? That's going to have the effect of disrupting your barrier function and causing way too much epidermal water loss. So, what is going to happen now? Well, number one, you're going to start to feel flaky. And the reason why is because we actually have naturally occurring enzymes in our stratum corneum, and their job is to help our skin slough off. So, just like enzymes like papaya and pineapple help to dismantle the keratin bonds between our keratinocytes, allowing for exfoliation, we actually have similar keratolytic enzymes naturally in our stratum corneum. But enzymes need water in order to work. So, if you've ever wondered why, when we're using enzymes as estheticians in the treatment room, we just really like to steam them, it's not the heat necessarily, it's actually the water that activates enzymes. So, when we have a really dry stratum corneum and that level of water drops below 10%, those enzymes that are naturally occurring cannot work properly, causing a big pileup of those dead skin cells that then forms those flakes and scales that we associate with dry skin. And all of those flakes and scales, it's going to cause the surface of the stratum corneum to be really rough. And that will be something that you can feel, which is not generally a good thing that we like feeling. And also, it's going to make our skin look dull because when we think of having bright skin, really it's the nice reflectivity of light that makes it look bright. And when you have disorganized and rough surface texture, it's going to cause the light to bounce in all sorts of different directions rather than in one really direct, prominent way. And so, therefore, our skin is going to look dull. Another thing is because we've damaged our barrier function and we have all this tool, we're going to be more prone to redness and itchiness and irritation because basically what's happening is that allergens and different chemicals and pathogens like bacteria are able to penetrate into the viable layers of our skin where they do not belong, because that's one of the main functions of our stratum corneum is to keep all those things out. So our immune cells that are found deeper in our skin in those viable layers will become activated, causing all of those problems, that redness. And you might have also experienced tingling and stinging when your skin is really dry. Like, let's say you put a moisturizer on and it burns you. What you're actually feeling is a disruption to the pH of your skin because those viable layers, those deeper layers of your epidermis, they actually have a higher pH than the stratum corneum. But pretty much all skincare products are formulated to be slightly acidic, like the stratum corneum. So when you put these slightly acidic products on the skin and you don't have a good barrier, those products are going to touch the viable layers of your epidermis where it will feel like an acid burn. So most of the time when you feel that stinging, it's not that you're having an allergic reaction to an ingredient in the product. It's simply dysfunction with the pH because your stratum corneum is so damaged and eroded. That product is touching the lower layers of your epidermis. So we have damage to this layer, we have increased tool, and these two things are going to actually make each other worse because the more tool, the worse barrier function, the worse barrier function, the worse tool, right? The other thing to keep in mind is also that our keratinocytes need to have water in them in order to have really good structural integrity and for them to do their jobs. We want water in the cell so that it can have that pliable, more plastic nature. It's going to do a better job of being those strong bricks in our brick and mortar foundation when they have water in them. If they are all desiccated and dried out, they're going to be more brittle when you're touching it or when that skin is moving. And that's also going to compound barrier disruption, right? So tool and barrier disruption go hand in hand. So going back to our little thought experiment about it being February and you starting a new exfoliant and you're having impaired barrier function and your skin is really dry, right? So what do? How are you going to fix it? So our first thought is, well, let's put water back into the skin. That can be accomplished with a few caveats. Number one, simply spritzing your skin with a mist or splashing your face with water, that can actually have the effect of further dehydrating you, because that is actually going to stimulate even more evaporation from the surface of your skin. So never splash water or spritz water without immediately putting an occlusive on over to trap the moisture in and prevent evaporation. You will actually be drier if you're spritzing without putting an occlusive over it. And that's also why, you're drinking all this water, you're trying to be healthy. I hear clients say this all the time, and they're complaining how dry their lips are. And they say, I don't understand. I'm always drinking water. How could my lips be so dry? Well, every time you are sipping water, just simply the presence of water on your lips is disrupting that barrier function a little bit and then causing rapid evaporation, which will eventually lead to even more dryness. So what I would say to that is just don't sip water throughout the day, just drink. So drink your 5 ounces, drink your 8 ounces, be done with it for an hour or two, and immediately apply a lip product to prevent further evaporation. And we can add water back into our stratum corneum. So let's say that you do, and you splash your face with warm water and then you immediately occlude it. Basically what's going to happen is you've just created a little mini rainforest that's now attached to your skin. So you created a 100% humidity layer with that water, and then you've sealed it in with an occlusive like a thick moisturizer, and that is going to have the effect of pushing that water into the skin. It can't evaporate because that occlusive is preventing that from happening, and it is going to push it into the skin, where there are going to be some little reservoirs of water that can form in between the skin cells that then can be absorbed into keratinocytes in certain situations. So interestingly, keratinocytes, or I should say corneocytes, so this is the corneocytes in the stratum corneum, they don't readily absorb water except for in the middle layer. So I mentioned that the stratum corneum has about 15 layers of corneocytes, and only the cells in the mid layer of the stratum corneum are going to readily absorb water. And they do that through water binding to the keratin filaments that are part of the outside of the cell that extend inwards. So those keratin filaments are going to extend out a little bit from the cell. Water is going to be absorbed into that keratin filament where it's drawn into the cell and then binds to the natural moisture factor, those compounds like amino acids, etc., within the cell. And you can actually see photographic evidence of that happening. You can see the corneocytes actually swelling, and they do it perpendicular to the surface of the skin. In other words, they're getting fatter. They don't get longer, they get fatter. But they will only really do that in the mid layers. The lower layers of the stratum corneum, the keratin is already bound to water, so more water and swelling is not allowed to happen. And in the upper layers of the stratum corneum, the keratin has become coiled and packed so tightly that it does not allow for that swelling to occur and that water uptake to occur. But yes, it is possible to add water back in to the skin, especially if you are then occluding it in and preventing evaporation. Okay, so here's another thought that you might have after you've, disrupted your barrier function and you're experiencing all this tool and dryness. Well, why don't we just replenish that lipid layer? Let's put more lipids into the skin to rebuild the mortar part of that brick and mortar structure of our stratum corneum. So this is technically possible, but it's harder than many people realize. We see a lot of buzzwords like ceramides and lipid and replenish your lipid layer. And this can happen, but really it only happens when you use a product that has the very specific ratio of the components of your natural lipid barrier. So it must have a 3:1:1 ratio of ceramides, cholesterol, and free fatty acids in the exact types as our naturally occurring lipid layer. If you apply a product of that nature, there is some evidence to suggest that it will help to rebuild that lipid layer. So a few more tips from me. What I'm currently doing, because it is winter here and my skin is a lot more dry, my clients are a lot more dry. Let me share with you what I share with my clients. Number one, after you cleanse your skin or after you get out of the shower, do not let your skin dry all the way before doing your skincare. The first thing I do when I step out of the shower is I quickly pat dry. I don't do a lot of rubbing though, just pat, pat, pat. And while I still have hydration on my skin, I will immediately put a humectant rich serum on my skin, which currently is the PCA hyaluronic acid boosting serum. And then I will immediately put moisturizer on my skin, which is the Rain Market Triple Mint Moisturizer. That moisturizer has squalane, avocado oil, safflower oil, and other occlusive oils that is going to trap and retain that moisture. But I didn't wait. I do it immediately after getting out of the shower. That is really, really important. Another thing I've done is I've reduced how much retinol I'm using. I've noticed that, especially for me, but really it's most people, in the winter, when we're dealing with this low humidity environment, we're having more sensitivity. All of these problems are starting to crop up with our barrier. Reduce your exfoliation. And the easiest way to do that is if you do use a retinoid, simply use it less or use less of it when you do use it. Well, I hope this has been interesting and useful for you, and everyone out there, stay hydrated.